Greetings. I recently listened to an interview that C.S. MGTOW had done with one Dr. Nemko. I would strongly recommend that you listen to it. It was quite interesting. In fact, C.S. MGTOW has been doing a veritable slew of interesting interviews with academic professionals, and there's a lot to learn and a lot to hear, and I would recommend you check them out. But having listened to that particular talk with Dr. Nemko, it got me thinking, and it sort of consolidated certain thoughts I had about a certain issue or a topic, specifically a political topic. Dr. Nemko, who himself is a centrist, politically speaking, based in the United States, had pointed out that things in the United States have probably swung far too much to the left, and he cited numerous examples. And I think I'm somewhat inclined to agree with him, to a degree. What I'm thinking now is the age-old question: is the enemy of my enemy my friend? I'm, of course, politically neutral, nonpartisan, but that, of course, doesn't mean I don't consider certain issues to be important. One issue that is a recurrent theme in recent times is the issue of censorship. I verily despise censorship, the kind of censorship that feminists tend to engage in and people on the extreme side of the left tend to engage in. Most recently, we heard about the story about the Canadian who might be facing jail because he disagreed with a feminist. And there are numerous other instances of this as well. We know, for example, on YouTube that many feminists have no comment policy, disable comments, etc. It's very rare that I disable, or rather, I never disable comments, that I block comments. Usually if there's an incitement to violence that could get my channel in trouble, then yeah, I'll get rid of it. But that's pretty much it, or if it's pure libel. Other than that, I'm pretty open-minded. But the active conscious attempt to completely censor activity, I find, is wrong. The freedom of the press, freedom of speech, it's one of the few things I actually like about the United States as a principle, and I wish other countries had the same degree of that, and people can disagree to the extent that it exists. In the United States, maybe there is no real freedom of speech, and we can argue about that and what have you, but in some very real sense, freedom of speech is still a founding principle, the founding principle, the First Amendment, that exists within the context of the United States and exists to varying degrees in other countries. The attack on freedom of speech and freedom of expression is, to me, one of the most egregious. I don't agree with censoring people. I'll give you an example. We all know, at the risk of repeating his name again, I don't like Sandman. I think his material is horrible. I don't like him at all. However, he had received some strikes or flags. I don't support that. I think Sandman should produce as much fecal matter as he possibly can. I don't need to like it, but he should have the right to do so. So this is the problem with extreme leftists at the current date. I mean, in the past, you had people in the extreme right wing, such as McCarthy in the 50s in the United States, who engaged in censorship and all kinds of not-so-pleasant activities. But at the moment, as the pendulum has swung so far to the left, it is primarily people of the extreme left that are engaged in censorship and preventing freedom of expression. I see this as a really bad precedent. We don't know how far it could go, and there's always the temptation to look at this kind of censorship as it's practiced by feminists as being kind of a joke. You kind of can laugh at it, and I suppose that's true to a certain extent, but the minute you get hit by it yourself, you're in some pretty dank, deep, swampy water. So the thought I have with regards to is the enemy of my enemy, my friend, the right wing, or the extreme right wing, or anyone on the right wing. I don't do political polarities in the sense that I do not align myself with a particular political pole. I try to look at each individual issue. But at this current juncture in history and time, it seems that if you want to eliminate censorship and uphold freedom of expression and speech, for better or worse, those on the right seem to be far better at supporting that principle than those on the left. And so you have to then ask the question, to what degree can you support a political ideology or a set of principles that may or may not be in concert with your own because of one issue, which is to say, is the right, say in my case, the right wing, is the right wing my friend because they, generally speaking, at this current point in time in our history, do not support censorship. I mean, there are exceptions, Rocky Mystery, etc., but I mean, this guy wants to use force, government or otherwise, to prevent people from doing certain things. But generally speaking, the right, particularly right-leaning libertarians, don't want and don't encourage censorship. And even those who have a much more centrist view or left-leaning tend to do that too. They tend to support freedom of expression and speech. And this is, of course, just one issue, and there might be other issues. But the more things progress and the more things develop in not just the manosphere, but in the internet in general, in our world, I grow increasingly concerned about the possibility of censorship, whether I'm censored, other people, peoples whose work I care about, such as Barbarossa, etc. This is a really dangerous issue. And it doesn't just go to the level of overt censorship. It's not just, well, you can't say something, you can't write something, you can't make a video about something. I'm going to be talking to, hopefully, Woden Willing, CS MGTOW, tomorrow, and we're going to talk about a lot of these issues as well as many others. It should be a fascinating talk, something to look forward to. But he had pointed out to me that he had tried to contact approximately 40 different neurobiologists and neuroscientists to do an interview with them, to have a talk with them. These are scientists who had published results primarily on the differences between male and female brains, volume, gray matter to white matter ratio, etc. They'd published these results saying, yeah, look, these are the differences. There are profound differences. And each time CS MGTOW tried to contact them, they refused, with not a single exception. Each and every one had refused. So we could call this self-censorship, but we all know why they're afraid to talk about the results. They're afraid of the implications. My feeling, for example, is that they are content to sort of just dwell in the shadows and do their work. After all, they're interested in their science, so why not continue doing it? And CS MGTOW had contacted both male and female neuroscientists, and not a single one of 40 had answered with a positive, affirmative, yes, let's do a talk, let's do an interview. So it's not just the overt censorship I'm talking about. It's not just the Canadian dude who disagrees with some feminists and then gets thrown in jail potentially, or a feminist on YouTube disabling her comments, or whatever. It's about the potential censorship that comes from this atmosphere of fear that has been bred, frankly speaking, by extreme leftists and feminists, which are more or less the same thing. Increasingly, this concerns me, because as many of you know, those who have been with me for a while, I think these issues of sexual dimorphism and I should talk a little bit more about that, and sex differences in general are so important to talk about, but we can't have an honest conversation about it. I'll give you another example. CS MGTOW has been doing, as I said, a ton of really interesting interviews with academic professionals, some of whom I've disagreed with on some issues, and some I just thought were just spot on. Had interviewed a professor at SUNY New Platz, I believe, in New York, who was the head of evolutionary psychology there, and nice guy, friendly guy, but he talked about a phenomenon that's been called evolutionary psychology 2.0. And this seems to, in his own words, have been a response to too much of evolutionary psychology focusing on sexual dimorphism. Well, What's the problem here? Well, there are a lot of interesting aspects of evolutionary psychology that have nothing to do with sexual dimorphism. I think intuitive physics is one of them. The idea, one example is the idea if you drop a ball within your line of sight, it doesn't look like it's moving forward when in reality, laws of motion and what have you, it is. There are other things we don't see can't see in the electromagnetic spectrum, etc. These are interesting things, but even once you move past that and don't talk about specific gender issues or sex-related issues, think about the notion of sharing altruism. It's almost certain that men and women practice altruism to differing degrees, have a different way of going about it. We know that men and women, when it comes to the prisoner's dilemma game theory, they operate along different lines as well, generally speaking. So many of the core ideas go back to these sex differences. And so evolutionary psychology 2.0 seems to be an attempt to move away from that so as to assuage and persuade the masses that evo-psych is not a bad thing. We can talk about all of these things. We can talk about naive physics. We can talk about maybe even some of social cooperation aspects of human beings. But by the gods, let us not talk about these actual sex differences, and let's certainly not talk about brain differences. Evolutionary psychology 2.0 seems to be a sham to me, because everything is a feedback loop. You cannot disregard some of the most crucial and important aspects of human nature, male and female, in favor of other aspects which are inevitably somehow going to be tied into those former aspects you're talking about. Now, there are other aspects, no pun intended, to this, and the issue at hand. The professor revealed that 70% of his incoming class, that is to his Evo Psych classes, was composed of females. And of course, women, generally speaking, tend to make up a large subset of psychology, but 70% is pretty extreme. Moreover, students are customers at the end of the day. So I can't help, but he couldn't express it. He probably felt pinned to a wall. I couldn't help but think that this whole notion of evolutionary psychology 2.0, and apparently Steven Pinker has been participating in this nonsense as well, is an attempt to whitewash some of the most important aspects of evolutionary psychology in order to please the masses, and particularly please women and feminists. And when you have all your customers, or most 70% of your customers being female, well, you can get into some serious trouble if you start talking about sex differences, physiological, psychological, what have you. They're all the same at the end of the day. Or they're at the very least extremely interrelated. This is another kind of non-overt censorship. Covert censorship. It's a censorship that's almost premeditated. So in the case of this endeavor called Evolutionary Psychology 2.0, these people, these participants, know that they're actively engaging in activity that could make evolutionary psychology more palpable to the masses, particularly the feminist and female masses. But I would argue, and will argue, that science is not there to be made palpable. Science is composed of data, of facts, of information. People, of course, can react to these facts, these data, and this information in different ways, but at no point in time does the true scientist, the seeker of knowledge, attempt to, in a premeditated way, make the results, and at least the subject of a study, most importantly, more palpable to the masses. And so my greatest concern is not the overt censorship, but the obvious censorship, the covert censorship that's been going on in academia and with reference to increasing our knowledge as a species and progressing as a species. Interestingly enough, the professor had announced in that talk, right-wing religious extremists were much more amenable to ideas of evolutionary psychology than left-wing extremists. So the question, gentlemen, is the enemy of my enemy my friend? I despise censorship, But one of the reasons why I despise it is because it is limiting us. We are, and I'm going to be talking more about this with CS MGTOW soon, it is limiting our progress as a species because people are so hell-bent on not being offended and not being put off to a certain topic or material that we will avoid it like the plague. And we are actually causing harm to people this way. As I talk about this tomorrow with CS MGTOW, we talk about medicine, pharmaceuticals, and related issues. But I constantly ask myself this question these days: is the enemy of my enemy my friend? I mean, the right and the left are always boxing with each other, and I find myself aligned with neither. I simply care about what's true, and I want to understand the world, and I want men to understand themselves in the world as well. I want them to seek knowledge, ideally. But in this case, I think if there were some concerted effort on the part of the right to get rid of censorship, to bring back intellectual integrity, and to remove the sense of fear in the academic community, I might very well support them. Because in this case, I do think the enemy of my enemy is my friend. A reluctant friend, not a friend I really want to spend too much time with, but in some vague sense, my friend. And indeed, this is the reason why ultimately I probably will not return to academia to pursue evolutionary psychology. Never mind the amount of extra material I'd have to study since I don't have an official background in it. I would be silenced. The kind of research and things that interest me, I would not be allowed to research it, and at the very least, I certainly wouldn't be allowed to publish the results. And not because of unsound methodology. I would do my best. I just wouldn't be able to express what I'm saying. So this is something to consider in the future, gentlemen, lords, and ladies, if there are any ladies watching. How important is a certain issue? And I think the issue of censorship is probably the most important issue we're facing, both as content makers and as people who are trying to understand the world. There are people out there who are too afraid to speak their mind. They might have their little powwows and huddled shadows and fires in the laboratory and talking about the results and how enthused they are. Don't you think most scientists are enthusiastic and enjoy sharing their results and information in the world, explaining to lay people what's going on? I think most people would be, but they're too afraid. Fear because of feminists and extreme left-winged people, and I think this needs to stop. So if there were people on the right who were very adamant about opposing censorship and allowing for academic integrity and intellectual honesty, heedless of the consequences and the feels of it all, I probably would support that person in his endeavors. So, as I said, something to consider. The enemy of my enemy, is he my friend? I think it depends on the context, but in this context, yes, he is not a particularly good friend, but this is such an important thing, be the censorship overt or covert, that I think it's something we really need to think about as we move forward, as individuals, as a community, as a collective of members of society. We cannot allow censorship to overtake things because we are literally losing human progress because of it. People in some cases are dying because of it, and we are just losing out. And this needs to be opposed at every angle if it can, but this can only be opposed if people get together and do it. That's all I have to say on this topic. As I said, tomorrow I plan on, Zeus willing, having tons of problems with my internet, but Zeus willing, and having a talk with CS MGTOW about not just this, but many related topics, multiculturalism, etc. Something to look forward to. And as always, thanks for watching, and may Woden watch over you. Bye-bye.